Okay. Yeah, people are coming in now.
Yes.
Good morning.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to another Auntie webinar. Let's give a few moments for people to come online so that everyone can be here from the beginning. While we are waiting, I will present our expert today, Margaretha Madoures, who will be presenting setting the limits as the topic for this webinar. And as we all know, well-being and setting your own limits go hand in hand. So it's a useful skill to make your life a bit more easy. As you are no doubt aware, this webinar will be recorded. Your microphones are on mute. So if you have any questions, you can freely post those in the Q&A section, and we will try and leave a few moments in the end for questions, should any arise. About 30 minutes is the length of this one, and we will try and keep to this time frame to respect everyone's workday and calendar on that time frame. But now it seems that most people have arrived, so Margaretha, stage is yours. Take it away.
Thank you so much. So yes, today I'll be talking about boundaries and setting limits with others and sometimes even with yourself. So a little bit about me first. I've studied clinical psychology. I'm also a certified relaxation therapist, and I've been working with Auntie for over 3 years now. Except from my work with clients, maybe there's even someone here who has been working with me in the role of Auntie. I also write blog posts and I hold webinars just like this one. So what are we going to do today? I'm going to discuss first some boundary basics because that's usually a good place to start. And then we're going to go into the question, when do I use them or when should I use them? Then thirdly, I'm going to talk quickly about your own emotions that are often connected with setting boundaries. For example, the question, why is it so difficult sometimes to set them? And then finally, the thing that we're afraid of, the reactions of others, and how to deal with them. So let's start with the boundary basics. Generally talking, boundaries are learned from life experience, often in our childhood, but not necessarily. But yes, that's usually when we start learning when it is in our environment appropriate to use them and when we shouldn't use them. And that's also usually when the foundation is laid for many people, why it is often difficult later on to set those boundaries. They are generally very much regarded as really good for the well-being, as everyone can probably attest who is struggling with them, because it is often, we all usually notice that we struggle with those boundaries because our well-being, our time, our energy is negatively affected by the lack of them. And then the good news is that we can improve those boundaries. Hopefully this webinar will help you to do just that. And finally, a couple of advantages of using boundaries is that they can help to avoid burnout. More about that later on. And you can also just generally develop a feeling of autonomy and identity, because you don't so often give in to others' ideas of and expectations, and you can set your own expectations for yourself and stick with them. So when do I use them? So here's a couple of ways that you can sort of see when you should start using boundaries, or some indicators that might help you to find out what those boundaries should be. So the first point that I want to talk about is to know your no's. What I mean by that is, what are some things that are just some deal breakers or some reasons for you to just generally say, okay, this is not okay with me. This type of behavior is not something I am accepting from other people, or this kind of environment is not one I feel comfortable in. The second one, to understand what your boundaries can be would be to ask yourself what your personal values are. Because when we know what our values are, it is easier to understand whether something is in accordance of our values or not. So that would be definitely something that I recommend you figure out for yourself. Find out what your personal values are, and then see if certain behaviors, certain environments help you to live in accordance to those. Then here's a bit of a tip, and that is to use discomfort as a signal to start using your boundaries. So often we, when we have a tendency to struggle with boundaries, it's really difficult to see, okay, when am I supposed to say no? How early am I supposed to set those boundaries? And one really good signal is your already innate ability to feel discomfort or feel uncomfortable in a situation. And that can be a helpful sign that, okay, this might mean that I have to put my foot down and say no to this, or tell this person to not speak to me in this matter, something like that. Something else that can help, especially if we don't generally have learned how to set boundaries, is to find someone in our environment who can be a bit of a role model. And here's a couple of things to know about that, because if we haven't learned how to set boundaries early on, we can sometimes look at people who are actually quite good at setting boundaries and feel like, wow, they are way too harsh. I don't like this person. I would not be that rude. And I want you to look beyond that and look at the behavior pattern and of these people or of that person, and see how there are maybe some bits, some small behaviors that they are applying that maybe might be of use of you, even if you don't want to be a complete copy of that person. Obviously, you want to be yourself still. And then finally, the point that you've probably heard before, self-care is not selfish. And I will be talking a bit more about that later on, but it's just the idea that self-care should be a priority. One of my favorite sayings when I work with clients is to live by the rule that you cannot pour from an empty cup. So it's absolutely important that you make sure you fill up your own cup, fill up your own energy levels, make sure that you are well first before you go out and help others and be there for others. So here's a little bit of a step-by-step idea of that. So the first step is to see, okay, what are my deal breakers? What are my no's? The second step is to use your discomfort as a signal to start setting boundaries. So when you're feeling uncomfortable in a situation and you haven't quite developed the automatic response to set boundaries, then this can be a very good indicator. And finally, the general rule that self-care is not selfish. No, because you're preventing your own cup from running empty. So you're not running on empty. So the next thing I'm going to be talking about is to to manage your own emotions with setting boundaries, because we've all been there. It's not a comfortable thing to do, to say no to that additional task from a manager, or say tell someone that they cannot speak to you in a certain way. So here is two very common emotions. On the one hand, we have, oh no, if I say no, they will be disappointed. And for example, they might not invite me next time. So that that kind of reaction is based on fear. And then you have the other quite common reaction is not again. Oh, I hate that nobody ever thanks me for my hard work. So this is the kind of anger that comes often afterwards, that we feel after we might have failed to set a boundary when we actually should have set one. So here's a couple of things about that. So setting boundaries, and that's a sad truth, it will always feel a little bit uncomfortable because generally we are being told that saying yes and being friendly and accommodating is the right way to be, even though that's not necessarily the healthy approach to life. So it's always going to feel a bit uncomfortable and contrary to what we have learned and what society often tells us we should be like and act like. Then there is a question that you can ask yourself in order to help yourself with the worries that often come with the idea of setting boundaries. And it's, how likely is the absolute worst case scenario that kind of pops up in my mind? How likely is it that it's really going to happen? And another thing that can help you to manage your emotions a little bit is kind of zoom out, think of the bigger picture. So zoom out and see like, okay, this moment of discomfort on the long term, how is that going to affect my life? Is it really going to be that difficult of a thing for me to do when I look back 2 years from now? Or is it actually just going to be one small step in the right direction? Then the next thing is that you can do difficult things. And often we might think in those situations that, oh no, this is way too difficult. I can't tell my boss that I won't be working long hours, or I can't stop responding to emails when I'm finally reaching home. But the thing is that you'd be surprised if you start doing these things now and going in the right direction now. In a couple of weeks, you'll be looking back on your own behavior and think like, wow, I've really done this. I have done difficult things in the past, which also means that in the future, you'll be able to do these types of difficult things. And finally, a little bit of positive news. It will get easier. The more often you are setting boundaries, you not only feel more comfortable setting them to begin with, but also the people around you that you're setting the boundaries with, they will learn to know, they will learn these boundaries, and there will be less pushback each time you hopefully use those boundaries. So now we're coming to the thing like the pushback that I just mentioned, the reactions of others, the things that we are scared of when we start setting boundaries. Does this look like something that you imagine when you imagine setting a boundary with someone you perhaps haven't set one boundary or a boundary like that before? If so, then you're definitely not alone. Most people get quite nervous and they really fear horrible reactions. So here is a couple of things that sometimes happen, but don't have to happen. So the other people around you might be confused and might be surprised to have a boundary set from you. There might be annoyance and grumbling from their side. They might even, in some cases, try to make you feel guilty for setting boundaries. They might give you the cold shoulder, or they might be disappointed in you and sometimes even communicate that. However, generally, I want to impress that on you that it is still a priority to take care of yourself. The reactions of others are often less related to how you're presenting the boundary, but more of a signal that the other person is experiencing some change in your behavior and they need time to adjust to that. So generally, I would say that saying no can definitely prevent a lot of stress for everyone involved, not just you. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that that in the future, you might be able to prevent a lot of stress for yourself by saying, for example, no to working long hours all the time, or by stopping to add extra tasks onto your desk when you're actually already on full capacity. But on the other hand, you're also preventing stress for other parties surrounding you. Yes, maybe in that situation, in that very moment, it might feel like, oh, so I'm not going to be able to do that task because I'm physically not able to. But what that means is that your no now might prevent you being unable to finish those tasks later on, because as I said, you don't have the capacity of completing that task. So if you say no early on, the other person might still have the option of finding someone who is actually able of completing the task. And this is what I mean when I say that you can prevent not only stress for yourself, but also for other people, because it's way more stressful to find someone else to pick up the slack when there's less time. The deadline has come much closer now. So here's a couple of step-by-steps in the moment that you can take to help yourself cope when you notice, okay, there's a little bit of backwind or like a backlash coming from me setting boundaries. First of all, and that's a really important step. And I know that probably you've heard of this many times, but it's because it works so well, or it's such an important factor. And it's to breathe and calm yourself. Because when we are setting boundaries and we're not used to doing that, then it can feel extremely stressful. And that is because it is a stressful situation. So breathing and calming yourself with like a slow exhale especially helps you to switch from that stress modus back into the relaxed modus, in which you're going to feel a lot more able to think creatively and calmly. Then the second point is to stay firm. While it might be your initial reaction or your learned reaction to give in, and instead of sticking with that boundary, to give in that moment and say, all right, fine, I'll do it. I recommend that you stay firm, obviously in a polite way, because again, you're not setting that boundary because of some random reason. You're saying no because you are not able to do this long term in a way, and you're not willing to take in on that extra work on that might later on lead you to like feel really tired and perhaps even develop something horrible like burnout. Something else that might help you in that very situation to kind of ground yourself again is to again visualize a better future. How is saying no going to positively impact my future self? How is that going to look like? What is it going to feel like if I, for example, don't have to work after hours? I'm leaving the office and then I'm actually off. How is that going to make you feel? Then a fourth thing is to give them time to adjust to the new situation. So that is specifically aimed again at the reactions of others. Give them time, give them a moment to adjust to the new rules that you're setting up. And eventually, in a healthy work environment, and honestly, in any kinds of private or work environments, they will learn to live with those new boundaries. And finally, just a reminder, it will get easier over time. I mentioned before that on the one hand, it will get easier because you are going to get better at setting boundaries. And on the other hand, it will get easier as because of the before mentioned reason, that people will have learned what your new boundaries are and they will not be pushing back for much longer. So remember that. So a couple of tips for success. We have quite some time left, so that's good. First of all, one thing that can help you in that very situation when you're still quite new to setting those boundaries is to request time to consider. So let's say you find yourself in the situation, you are in a meeting with a couple of people, and in the past, you have usually been the one that picks up the slack. And you've noticed that, well, actually, I'm not able to do that every time. And that you want to do that differently in the future. So rather than having an answer ready straight away, what you can do to help yourself say no later on is to ask for a little bit of thinking time. For example, you could say, hey, I can think about it, but let me get back to you about this later on. I have to check in my calendar. I have to check with the ongoing task to see if I can accommodate for this one. And the second tip is it might sound a bit funny. So, okay, what do I mean by put a crown on? Do I mean that you should put a crown on and then you feel magically better and stronger and it's easier for you to set boundaries? Sure, if it helps you. But in the past, I've had some really good input from previous clients of mine. And one of them said that they were working from home a lot and their kids would interrupt them all the time during work hours, which obviously wasn't great for productivity and getting things done. So what they came up with is to signal to their kids that there was no talking to that person when that person was wearing a silly little plastic crown. So that crown was indicating to the kids, okay, when my parent is wearing that crown, then they have to focus. I'm not to disturb them unless it's an absolute emergency. Am I telling you to put on a plastic crown in your work environment? No, I'm not telling you to do that. But there's other ways that you can show people that you are currently not available. So for example, you could block out deep work time on your calendar that is visible to other people. But you can also put a note on your on the door of your office or even on the back of your chair to let people know that, hey, I'm currently really trying to focus here. So if it's not an emergency, please do not interrupt me. And then here's another tip for in meetings. Slowly count to 10 before you shout or before you say yes to a task that you might actually not be able to accomplish or not be willing to accomplish. So we have that situation that a lot of people have been in before. So they find themselves in a meeting and then usually towards the end of the meetings, tasks are being distributed. And for people who struggle with setting boundaries in those situations, there's this awkward silence that we all dread. And my challenge to you would be to say, okay, I'm quietly counting to 10 or 15 or 20 or whatever, just for you to not give in and then stick your hand up and add tasks to your desk that you're not able or willing to accomplish afterwards. And finally, here's a final tip. Progress is the goal, not perfection. It's not going to go completely smoothly all the time. It might on occasions, which is great, but please don't beat yourself up when you're falling back onto maybe older behavior patterns when you first start to learn to set boundaries. It's normal. You will always have little moments in which you feel more strong than in others. Maybe with certain people, it's easier than with others or in certain environments. So don't beat yourself up, because self-compassion in the long term will get you further than beating yourself up for making mistakes. All right. So here's if you will, a couple of take-home messages that you might want to take with you, but of course, you can take anything else from the webinar as well if you want. So here's the first one. Generally, the knowledge that boundaries are absolutely essential for your mental and physical well-being. So it's absolutely worth putting in the effort. Experiencing discomfort is part of the process. There is no way to avoid this, but the good news is that it will get easier over time and it will become less uncomfortable. And further on, with time, others will accept the new situation or they will have to adjust if you stick with them. So again, it will get easier over time. So here's a couple of references, and that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Margaretha. It was really good, insightful tips on the matter at hand. Should you have any questions for our expert here, please write them in the Q&A section, and I will present them. If any questions won't arise, I have to say that I love the example of putting the crown on your head. I have to take that into consideration at home whenever I'm at the home office with my sons.
Yes.
One question came here. So how to cope with the feeling of insufficiency or not being good enough when, for example, saying no working for overtime?
That's a really good question and a difficult one. Yeah, well, there's a couple of tricks that long-term might help you to feel less insufficient or effective, if that's what you mean. So often people who have problems setting boundaries struggle also with like their self-confidence, right? Boundaries, it takes a lot of self-confidence to set them. So the worry of, okay, what if I feel like I'm not working quickly enough, well enough, if I say no and I'm signaling to others that I don't. But one thing to remember in those situations is that you're not setting those boundaries because of inert laziness. Most of the time we set boundaries because we are literally physically incapable of doing those types of tasks within the paid hours. So it definitely makes sense to still stick with them, and over time it will get easier. Oh, there's a lot of questions popping up. I don't know if we can. And one small trick that can help you to over time kind of improve your self-confidence is to keep record of your successes. Put a folder or like a worksheet or a notebook somewhere where whenever you get positive feedback, when you notice yourself succeeding in something, write it down and regularly check in with those notes to remind yourself of everything that you're actually really good at. So that over time might help you to broaden your view of your abilities versus that probably overarching feeling of I'm not good at things.
Yes, thank you. Let's be mindful of the time, but one question here is that, okay, it's clear on how to settle this within colleagues and friends, but then how about with the ones closest to you? Husbands, wives, parents, any thoughts on that?
Yes. So basically the question is, it's clear how we set boundaries in the work environment because the rules are quite clear, but with loved ones in our private life, it's often more difficult. So the thing is that that in this environment is also really important to set boundaries. And one way of approaching that is to have like an open conversation about things. And the thing is that in the private environment, there's often a bit more backlash when you set boundaries, because of course you have a longer history with people like that. And these are people that you often chose to spend time with. So it's more difficult. So one tip could be to have like set a time in which you have this kind of conversation about, okay, so I've noticed this and that, and I'm not really feeling well when you do that, or when I'm exposed to this. Let's find a better way of dealing with that. So have a very open, clear conversation about it. It often makes sense to arrange for a conversation like that beforehand, so that the other person knows what they're getting into, and it's not all of a sudden there and they haven't expected it at all. So that can really help with those types of issues. Yeah.
All right. There's 3 questions. I will try and group this into one. So in a nutshell, so what would be the best tips and tricks on recognizing on your own capacity? So when are you at your own limits? And then recognizing on that that thought, that what are the things that I should definitely say no to, and how do I know if I'm conflicting with others' boundaries?
Okay. All right.
It's a big question, but let's try.
Yeah. Okay. So 2 tips for the first part of the question. So the first part about recognizing your own abilities of what would I be able to actually achieve, let's say during work hours, is to think back. How long do certain tasks usually take me? Because that's usually a better indicator of how long it's going to take you in the future, rather than thinking what should be ideally the case for myself, or what should be my expectations for myself. So think back how long these tasks usually take you, and then use that information to make to kind of even calculate how much time this would take you, and use that for most of your tasks in your workspace. And this way it will be easier for you to see, okay, do I actually have the resources? And then you can, based on that data, you can say no or yes, depending. The other tip, I don't know if I remember now. Might come back to me later. Would you repeat the second part of the question?
Second part was mainly on how to recognize that when might you be conflicting with other people's boundaries.
Okay, so here's a bit of a hard truth. Sometimes that means you will be conflicting with another people's boundaries. And that is usually why it feels so uncomfortable, right? So in order for you to find out what boundaries are worth for you defending, because once you decided on the boundary, you should really be sticking with it, because otherwise the message can get kind of diluted. So I really recommend that figure out what the absolute no's are. What is the minimum requirement for you to be working well or experiencing a good private environment? One thing that can help, and now that's my second tip that I forgot for me, is to see what would you say to a good friend. So often it's very difficult to think about your own boundaries, but what would you suggest to a friend, or what would you say to a friend in that same situation? What would you recommend for them? And often it's way easier to give tips for others than for yourself. So that might be a good starting point to figure out which one are your like hard boundaries are going to be. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Hey, we went about 4 minutes over time, so apologies on that, but there are some excellent questions and some excellent answers also. So thank you from our part for a very insightful webinar, Margaretha, and we will see you in our next webinars in October.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, enjoy your day and have a good day. Bye.
Bye.